Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real Conversations about Aging Parents. This is your host, Rebecca Tapia. Thank you so much for joining me today, and thanks for moving through this series with me. We are now part 4 of a 6-part series of who, what, when, where, why, and how, as providing a structure for us to continue talking about all of the fun issues related to supporting aging parents, elders, loved ones, etc. So today we're going to talk about when. Before I get into that, we've already discussed who is on our ADL, which is our affection and duty list. So you can listen to that episode and get a little more information about that. So who is in our orbit that we might end up taking care of, and then what kind of care they might need, and then where that care might occur. So each of those is its own individual exploration in the podcast. But today I'm going to focus on when, and I probably could have made this a 5-minute episode, because I could just write it's just to be determined, who really knows? And that just is the fact of life, that things come up very suddenly. Some things creep up on us very slowly. That's just the ebb and flow of life. But you know me, I'm going to go a bit deeper than that. So acknowledging first the uncertainty of when things happen or how fast they're going to progress or improve or recover. Let's just step into this. I know it sounds scary, and this one is probably the highest amount of fear because it's kind of living under a cudgel of something that may drop on your head at any point. But no, let's just talk about it objectively. That's going to help the brain really understand what's going on. So when might somebody need some extra care? So let's just talk about incidents over time. As we age, particularly going over the age of 65, the risk of needing extra care or support increases over time. Risk is a weird word. I don't know. It's not like a disease or something. It's just aging. But the chances or incidents that somebody may need extra support will increase over time and increase nearly exponentially after about the age of 80. And so you're getting into a situation where the vast majority of people getting up past that age are requiring some sort of care. So the other way I can answer this question is I say, when might this happen? And you could just think to yourself, well, at the worst time possible. So whenever you're entering a phase of your life where you'd be like, it's the worst time possible for somebody else to need my time and attention, you already know. But if that's not you, then let's talk a little bit more deeply about the when. There's 2 types of when this might happen. First is sudden, unexpected, or maybe, you were kind of in the window that something might happen and then it happens. So when we talk about sudden events, you're thinking about a fall, a stroke, a cardiac or pulmonary issue like a heart attack or pneumonia. Those are, maybe somebody's higher risk or if they've had these issues before, but those can sort of come out of nowhere. That can be fine one day, not fine the next day. And I feel bad. I am not doing this to scare you. I am doing this to help the brain sort of understand what the whole picture looks like. And my hope is that none of this happens to you or anybody that you are supporting. But just to have an idea of the when is highly variable, right? Especially for the sudden events like I just described. Now, the opposite end of that are slow events, or hopefully no events, right? Maybe that's the real opposite. But for slow events that slowly get worse over time, I'm thinking things like diabetes, memory problems, or musculoskeletal issues, meaning they're having more trouble walking. And they kind of go from, as we talked about in the Walk Aids podcast, from walking without any support to walking with a cane to walking with a walker. So these slower progressions, which over months to years, the when is a little bit easier to understand. Not that all of these have a linear progression, but they don't tend to wildly fluctuate. So as something is getting worse, you kind of have an idea of the rate of how it's worsening. You kind of have an idea, and it's easier to keep track of because say you see that person once a month or every 6 months, then your brain is kind of subconsciously mentally checking and understanding hey, that looks a little different than it was before. And so you can think about that in terms of predicting out the rate of progression. So the conditions that are slower developing gives you a little bit more time to plan. It gives you a little bit more time to predict and support that person or predict future needs. Like, so by the time somebody is having difficulty walking more than, say, 20 feet in the walker, that's like the window of time. If you're one step ahead, is thinking, okay, well, how are we going to get these modifications for wheelchair level or support at a wheelchair level? And sometimes I've seen some families just kind of have cutoffs, like once so-and-so is in the wheelchair, once so-and-so is needing assistance with going to the bathroom, that's when we look at assisted living or paid support. They might already have kind of these like posts set up ahead of time, and maybe those criteria are met, but with a lot more prediction and help. And so if you can think about, there's both components of time. There's how is this condition that might rob them of their independence, right? How is that condition progressing? And then what other conditions could happen suddenly. Now, I'm not suggesting you spend a long amount of time contemplating this about all of your loved ones or people that you may end up supporting and freaking yourself out. That's not the point. The point is, when I'm thinking about something from a lot of different aspects, that helps me kind of put all the pieces together and understand what this really is and how this all works. And so the when is really where the fear comes in. It's the uncertainty of, well, that just came out of nowhere and that could happen again. And so understanding those two components of the when, the chronic and then the fast or acute, I think it can be helpful. And also knowing which conditions do what. So although diabetes itself is a fairly slow progression, you don't go from not having diabetes one day to having uncontrolled diabetes the next day. But the diabetes itself, although that's a relatively slow condition over time, that is a risk factor for the fast condition. So diabetes sets you up to have strokes and heart attacks as well. And so they're kind of related in some ways, and other ways they're not. Or the diabetes makes the feet go numb, which increases the fall risk. And so then people could fall and hit their head and end up in the emergency room. Or like for my grandmother, the reason she's no longer living here is she was doing pretty well. Her mobility had slowly but noticeably worsened over the 8 years she was here. So when she came in, she'd use a walker sometimes, but was walking around without one most of the time. And by the time she left, she was pretty much hunched over with her elbows and wrists resting on the walker as she moved forward. And so that was an 8-year progression. Now, cognitively, there was some mild to moderate progression in her forgetfulness and thinking, but not to the point where it would have precluded her living independently or with a little extra supervision. What really became the problem is she had an acute issue, meaning she had a GI bleed, a bleed in her stomach, and she was bleeding and not realizing she was bleeding. And that's a whole other story. But anyway, and very well detailed in all the podcasts about this last summer. But I wasn't realizing she was bleeding, didn't tell anybody she was bleeding. We didn't notice she was bleeding because she has a private bathroom, and I hadn't noticed any problems there, and became very anemic and became so anemic she fell, hit her head, had a head injury. Luckily, no other fractures or anything. But after all that, at the age of 90, despite extensive rehab, was not able to get back in a position where she could independently get to and from the bathroom or really even get out of bed without bear hug support, which is, grabbing that person, pulling them up out of bed and getting them into a wheelchair. She is currently not using a walker. So that necessitated a change. Now, I didn't know in the middle of it when might this happen. I knew in my head that we were heading towards some sort of fall or event at some point, but I didn't know. I could tell you the risk was increasing slowly over time, especially because of the fall that she had. It wasn't a series of falls. It wasn't like she had fallen several times before that. It was that she got lightheaded and weak from the anemia, from the bleeding, and that caused her to fall. And then that fall, combined with the head injury and everything else, required her to need more care. So the fast issue was the bleeding and the fall. And so typically what's going to push a system and add more stress to a care ecosystem is the fast stuff, because suddenly you need extra support and care versus the slow stuff. And the slow stuff, again, you just get more warning and you have a better idea of the way things are going. And so that's kind of how I conceptualize the slow things that are happening and then the fast things. And so for my dad, he's obviously, as I've talked about, living independently, but the number of hospitalizations he's had has had an uptick year over year. So this year he's had 2 in the first half of the year. One of them was for an elective procedure, so I won't count that. But he basically has had 2 in the first 6 months. And I've noticed it. I thought, well, before I think we were doing about 1 a year and maybe less than that. And now we've had 2 in the first 6 months. And so that doesn't necessarily change the way I think about it, but I'm noticing it because I'm player 1 in his care ecosystem. And I have 3 brothers that are player 7, 8, and 9. So I'm obviously very involved in his ecosystem, and that is just something I'm noting and being aware of. So something I do differently is I called him yesterday. We were just chatting about urinary tract infections. I asked him if he was having any symptoms. He said that he was, and he couldn't seem to think of a criteria or a threshold to get treated. And okay, for somebody that just spent like 10 days in the hospital for a urinary tract infection, not even 6 months ago, and he's having symptoms again, he's still, I don't know, denial or who knows. Had already been having symptoms for 3 days when I happened to call him. And I just strongly suggested that maybe he should go get some care for these symptoms. And so that's an example of something I wouldn't normally ask about. So that's what that fast issue taught me is he had maybe difficulty identifying the symptoms, or maybe his symptoms are very subtle in the way that his body works. So that was a way that I support him, not in a, you better go to the doctor right now, but, it would be good if you started some treatment or got some evaluation for this. So each time you go through these fast episodes, they're also a teacher. Like, here's what this person is prone to. Here's what this person might have happen again in the future. And so that is a prime concern for him. And if I'm part of that system, then I'm helping pay attention to that. But of course, and hopefully a non-judgmental, non-pushy, robbing somebody of their own privacy and autonomy. And I would say part of this discussion could be prolonging the when. When is this going to happen? And part of that goes back to fall prevention. So you can delay the quote unquote when that's going to happen. And it's not entirely random. So you think about things like just adherence to medical recommendations. So taking medications as they're prescribed, going and getting screenings when they're indicated, and supporting somebody to go get a required mammogram or colonoscopy, and identifying something early could save you tons and tons of money and stress and trauma later if you can get something caught early. Of course, that doesn't happen all the time. Other ways to hold off the when would be physical activity. That is in my top 3. So keeping somebody physically active, and I don't mean going to the gym necessarily and lifting weights unless that's a thing they like to do, but facilitating any kind of activity, especially one that the person enjoys or has a tendency towards, preserving that activity to the extent possible will help delay the wins. So preserving physical activity, social connections does help, not 100% of the time, kind of push those wins out even further. And I just want to take some time to acknowledge that part of the distress around this topic, around caring for people or being in the support system for people, is just that we don't know. We just have a lower incidence of this when we're younger, a higher incidence when we're older, and people are getting into that window of life, that time of life, that phase of life where that's getting more and more difficult. So the very unsatisfactory summary of this topic is the when it increases over time as we age, accelerates once we get over the age of 80, and then the time can be fairly predictable. For chronic diseases, the when is fairly predictable, and for more sudden issues like falls, strokes, heart attacks, the when can be very, very unpredictable. One of the discussions you might be able to have with a primary care doctor or geriatrician, they probably have in their head, even if they're not saying it out loud, what the patient is at highest risk for. They do that for a living. They see people with that same set of health conditions. And if that is a discussion you'd like to have with them, or that your loved one or elder or supported person might like to have, then I think that would be a productive discussion as well. The other way to think about this, and take it from the other direction, is not necessarily when is that going to happen? When is that care need going to arrive for that person? So we've already talked about that. But when in your life, when in your epoch or your chapter is it going to arrive? So is it going to be when you still have kids at home? So I kind of argue that if you do have children, that point between having children at home and then having an empty nest, if that's in your cards. I know there's a lot of children that stay living with their parents beyond high school, but that delineation of I am caring for somebody under 18 or I'm not, So that would be relevant for you. So when in the chapters of your life, when is this happening or going to happen? And so it depends a lot also on the spacing of ages between the mother and the child. So you and your parent or grandparent. So if your mother gave birth to you when she was 41 years old, then that when might hit at a different time in your life. So that person is hitting their 80s right at the time that you're probably raising school age kids and in the middle of the career, versus if your mom gave birth to you at 16, that much shorter gap of biological years between one person and the next makes a difference, right? Because they're only 16 years older than you. They're almost a peer, if you think about it in some ways, just over what a sibling might be. So my siblings are 10 years apart. And then so if your parent was 16 years apart, not as big of a difference as a parent being 40 years older. So that would be important to think about, is just the difference in biological age. And that could be different than the health difference. Maybe you're somebody in your 40s with a lot of chronic medical conditions, an autoimmune disorder like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, and the potential aging parent is relatively healthy, or maybe that parent is still helping somebody. I have seen so many patients in their 40s and 50s at these long-term care or rehab type settings, and the person that's showing up and helping them is their mother or their father, who might be in their 70s or 80s. And so although in speaking in generalities, it's not just necessarily the biological age difference of X number of years, then you can also look at the health difference. And it may be that a need occurs for them when you're caring for yourself. So you may have multiple hospitalizations or some chronic medical condition, something going on, or even a mental health condition. But if you're dealing with a chronic depression and that kind of ebbs and flows or goes up and down, or bipolar disorder, then the timing of when they might need care and when you might need care for yourself, obviously that can unfortunately align in very bad ways. So the larger the ecosystem, and that's a luxury and a blessing to have a large care ecosystem for someone. So when you're part of a large number of people or resources that can help that person, that makes it a little bit easier for you to be at ease as when something might happen and how you can care for yourself. But in some situations, you are the ecosystem. You're an only child, or everybody else has kind of gone about their way, and that you're taking care of a parent who is widowed. And that's challenging. That is kind of the more extreme, I would say, high torque situation. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of compounding pressure over time. And so my heart goes out to you if you're in that situation, trying to take care of yourself, and then you become like the sole human on the earth, invested and interested in supporting this person, even if you have, as we talked about before, low affection or even negative affection for that person. And that is a really tough situation. And anyway, I know this is on the shorter side, but hopefully that brief discussion of when is helpful. We are going to move forward to why and how. Those are the last two in the series. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for listening. Until then, have a great week.